Anyone who believes in indefinite growth on a physically finite planet is either mad or an economist.
We don't want to focus politics on a notion that involves the rejection of principles around which a large majority of our fellow citizens organize their lives.
We are not as endlessly manipulable and as predictable as you would think.
To what extent is my status in life, or any of our status in life, predictable from the kind of house we grew up in? And what is the mechanism that is linking us to these previous generations and to the circumstances of our birth? So it's a question just of the strength of inheritance, and then secondly, the mechanism of inheritance. And the simple way that economists have chosen to measure social mobility is just what's the correlation between your status and the status of your parents. Okay? If that correlation is 1, then at birth, all of your outcomes are perfectly predictable. If it's 0, every generation is born anew, nothing is predictable. And the standard results on intergenerational correlation, there have been many, many measurements of this for income, for years of education, for occupational status, is that that correlation is actually quite low, varying between 0.2 and 0.6. And that implies that if only your parents matter to your outcome, within 3 or 4 generations in most societies, all earlier status will have been lost, and there are no lineages that matter once we get to grandparents or great-grandparents. That societies are really born anew every 3 or 4 generations. The other thing that that research seems to establish is that social mobility rates vary substantially across societies. And here's a recent example of this, which is looking at the intergenerational correlation of earnings. And then at the bottom, it's showing what is the degree of inequality of income within societies. And what you find is that there are a bunch of Nordic societies, Sweden, Norway, Denmark, which have both highly equal conditions and also apparently a very small intergenerational correlation. And the implication of this data, by the way, is that in somewhere like Sweden, only 4% of the current generation's income variation is explicable from their parents. 96% is some kind of random component, their own individual personality, accidents. Only 4% is explicable by parents. You find out the UK and the US have intermediate levels of inequality, intermediate levels of correlation, and then South America is associated with high inequality, high degree of correlation. And what this figure implies is that some societies must be having dramatic failures in social mobility. That in some societies there must be many people of potential talent who are trapped in unrewarding jobs or jobs that don't fulfill their full potential. And there must be a lot of people who don't have talent who are finding themselves still at the top positions within these societies. And so that variation implies that there is a very significant social mobility problem and that it's something that policymakers really need to pay attention to. And what else do we get from this? That variation also suggests that it's culture, human capital, and connections that are the main transmitters of status within societies. If the correlation is only 0.2 in somewhere like Scandinavia, it implies that the role of basic genetics in transmitting status has to be very low, right? Because that force will operate everywhere, and that consequently most of people's outcomes in lives are determined by social conditions, culture, social elements. It's not a lot to do with the basic biology of inheritance. Okay? What we do is actually track social status by using surname lineages. And so the surname is this interesting thing that people carry, which is the one thing that links them to a distant past. And an example of this in England is that there was a medieval surname, Arballistarius, which meant crossbowman, and which I think is found even in the Domesday Book. And was not held by that many people, and then subsequently, the holders of that name moved down socially so that they no longer understood Latin. And so the name became both Arblaster and Alabaster, and there's about 200 people holding each of those names now. But we can say of those people, 20 generations ago, you were descended from someone who was a crossbowman on the patriline. And so that's true, as I say, of large numbers of names in somewhere like England and in many societies where we can actually track back through many, many generations this one line of descent. And we're only looking at the patriline because of the nature of inheritance. But there's good reason to believe that that is similar to all the other lines of descent. The mating is so assortative that mothers and fathers tend to match up very closely in social status. So it doesn't matter if you only look at the patriline. You'll see the same pattern as if we could look at the matriline and all the intermediate lines as well. So with the surname method, what do we expect? What we would expect is that even though in medieval England, surnames differed very significantly in social status. And I can give you an example. Anyone named after a place had a high status name in the Middle Ages. If you're named a patronym such as Williams, that's a low status name in the Middle Ages. And so these names came with status in the beginning. The Norman surnames were very high status in early England. But within 3 or 4 generations, if the standard studies of social mobility are correct, all surnames should become equivalent. And surnames should not reveal anything about social status except for rare surnames which by random chance can move up or down the status hierarchy. Okay? But in general, surnames could quickly lose all information, and the rate at which they lose that information about status can be translated into what's the intergenerational correlation of status. And you have all kinds of measures of status, and one simple one is just, did you attend Oxford or Cambridge in England, where we have records going back to 1200.